Hello, it's wonderful to be here and thank you for having me. My name is Gaurav Basu and I am a graphic artist and designer from Bangalore. And I'm here to talk about the role visual art and music plays in giving birth to subcultures in our society. Now, I've been part of the independent music circuit here in India for about 13 to 14 years, both as a performer and a visual artist. I actually am the vocalist of a death metal band from Bangalore called Inner Sanctum. As you can see, I love giving people high fives, but people sort of stand me up. But yeah, perhaps you've heard of us. I don't know. We've had the fortune of opening for some of the biggest metal bands when they came to Bangalore, namely Metallica, Slayer, and Testament. Now, in the world of heavy metal, that's pretty huge. That's like being on a science and technology panel with Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and Bill Gates. But you know, leaving that aside, like, how on earth did I end up being a fan of a type of music that culturally had no relevance to our society? And remind you that I was coming from a time when music was still hard to come by. Like, you know, if it wasn't on Channel B on MTV, like it was hard to get access to it. Like, we didn't have the internet back then. But so, what happened was, like, as a young person growing up in India, I did not find many avenues to, like, you know, express my feelings of frustration. Feelings of frustrations towards society, feelings of frustration towards our faulty education systems or things at home. And this internalization of these feelings was not healthy. Yeah? I was angry. I was very, very angry. Angrier than Leonidas when he kicked that Persian into the dark pit in the movie 300. Yeah? And you know, every time I walked past a music system, it was only Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears, and it was frivolous and superficial, and it didn't do anything for me. And then something magical happened. I found the world of heavy metal. Long-haired dudes with crushing guitars and, you know, pounding drums and a bad attitude introduced themselves to me, and the rest is history. I was absolutely hooked. And what was most fascinating was, like, you know, there was an unapologetic attitude that these guys had, and where they did not care about, like, you know, what people thought of themselves, and they were completely about freedom of expression. And there was also a very, very morbid aesthetic that went along with it, which was very, very intriguing. Now, some people like horror movies. I like horror music. But my fascination with horror goes a long way back. I grew up in Calcutta for a bit. I spent a small part of my childhood there, and whenever my mom or my grandmother would tell me certain stories, like, it would be from, like, you know, these horror stories from Bengali folklore, and some of them were pretty scary. Like, it involved ghosts and demons, and mind you, most of these demons, you know, were like these Hollywood movie demons that, like, you know, were taking over someone's mind and things like that. These guys were scary. Like, these guys were cannibals. They'd come and eat you. And, you know, as a child, when you hear this stuff, like, it scars you. But I loved it. Yeah? But at the same time, like, you know, this influenced me to start drawing. And naturally, like, you know, morbid imagery just started to flow out of me. And these are some of my works, like, that I've done over the years. And as I kept drawing, like, you know, as a child, I realized I've always wanted to play in bands and design, like, you know, artworks for bands. And thankfully now I do, and I have the opportunity to do that professionally. And I've been doing that for almost about 10 years now. I've had the pleasure of designing, like, album covers, t-shirts, posters, and all sorts of other kinds of merchandise for, like, you know, artists, both at a national and international level. But how did I get here? How did I, you know, find my calling, as people would say it? It goes back in time. I don't know if you recognize these two individuals. One is Mike Shinoda and the other one is Joseph Hahn, both of whom performed for this band called Linkin Park, which were very influential for me in my teenage years. Primarily because both of them are designers, and these two, like, were on this pathway where they kind of were expressing themselves through art and design from within the framework of the band. And that was, you know, new to me, and I was pretty fascinated by it. And I was like, oh, you can do that? And sometimes they were collaborating with artists and creating these murals, which weren't even making it to the album covers. But it's the fact that, you know, they wanted to see their ideas come to life. That was what was impressive. This spirit of, like, you know, creative collaboration that they sort of embodied, that was the culture that I wanted to adopt into my life. From that onwards, like, the age of social media happened, and this opened it up, like, hugely. Before there was Facebook and Instagram, there was something called Orkut, and in the later coming years, I got introduced to so many people from, not just from my own country, but across the globe. And eventually, what happened was we realized that we not only have the same music taste, it went much beyond that. It went into like things that was more personal to us. Things like values, beliefs, things, opinions about art, gender, sexuality, even politics. It was extremely empowering finding my own tribe. Now, while all these movements are like happening, like people are finding each other and like engaging with each other, you have to understand that it largely goes unnoticed by the rest of society, primarily because these are underground movements. But this is how a lot of music subculture movements have taken off across the globe in since the 1960s. Essentially, it's like a movement of people, it's a gathering of like-minded individuals that sort of collaborate with creative individuals on projects that eventually gives birth to a movement that is built purely on passion. I mean, it has to be built on passion because there's no money in it otherwise, but that's another different thing. But why is the 1960s so pivotal in this topic? Because primarily, one very interesting thing happened from the 1960s where music started becoming the voice of a certain generation. When you look back in time, it wasn't just about the music, but it was also about the kind of message that these guys were putting out. It represents the era, the pain and the anger of that particular generation of that era, and that was something that was becoming important in society. And young people were finding their own tribe in a way where they kind of relate on multiple facets of life. And as a young person, as an adolescent living in India, this was very influential to me, to know that if I don't relate with something, that I could strip it off and totally replace it with something that I completely related to, that was something that was appealing to me. But now, let's jump into, enough about me, let's jump into something a little more fun here. All forms of music has a parallel visual art culture. And why so is because the sonic part of it needs to have an aesthetic that kind of resembles it, and it needs to represent it in the correct format. Essentially what happens is visual art in music tends to represent not only the background of the artist where they're coming from, it could be their cultural background, which neighborhoods they grew up in, their influences, their love for things like comic books, or even something as simple as help you pick the mood that you are in, whether you want something relaxed or soothing, or whether you want to go heavy and something scary. And at the same time, I know that can be a little intimidating, going, oh, that's not for me, that's intimidating. But for some people, it strikes the right chord. But it's important to know that visual art in music essentially stems from it's a marketing tool, you could say. It's part of the packaging machinery that ultimately promotes the artist, and that's how it has been from the business sense of things. If you notice in mainstream culture, you would usually have a very attractive pop star with a very striking pose. You'll have some swanky designer who's done this really big concept and everybody's talking about it. But there is a part of the industry that isn't focused on pure vanity and something that I personally consider a little more superficial. There's a part of the industry which talks about artistic expression and talks about building communities. And this is known as the scene. This involves independent labels and independent YouTube channels, essentially curators of a certain type of music, and they build these communities by spreading a certain kind of music for a certain kind of people. And this goes back to that voice of a certain generation that I'm talking about. It's sort of socially representing that community in front of an audience, and these guys sort of promote a certain type of music, and they distribute it and organize festivals, shows that multiple people go to, and you not only get to know people, but you also end up building a large community of people that really what can I say? It really helps in sort of lasting friendships, and it helps in like getting together and at the same time listen to just music. Now, when you go to the 60s and 70s, like this is when people are kind of pushing the boundaries of artistic expression in a way where people are playing guitar with their teeth and experimenting with things like psychedelics, and that in turn itself gave rise to a whole genre of art and music. In fact, when you look at the psychedelic art and music, it's come a long way from the 60s bearded hippie that that we know of, and it is making an impact in today's day and age. But what do we see here? It is a a visual representation of that music, a visual representation of that culture, the intentional distortion of type and making it like overtly colorful. It was like, this is what Pink Floyd would look like if you were listening to it. This is what Led Zeppelin and Grateful Dead, these guys would sound like if you were listening to them. This is how it wasn't just about promotion, it was about building culture, and it was about creating collectible pieces. And the foundation laid by these poster artists from the 60s and 70s was so strong. Distortion of type and making it like overtly colorful. It was like, this is what Pink Floyd would look like if you were listening to it. This is what Led Zeppelin and Grateful Dead, these guys would sound like if you were listening to them. This is how it wasn't just about promotion, it was about building culture, and it was about creating collectible pieces. And the foundation laid by these poster artists from the 60s and 70s was so strong. We can see the influences even today. Mind you, these are posters and artworks that have come out in the past decade, and we can see a strong influence from the 60s and 70s being adopted into this format. We still have the distorted type and the use of bright colors and things like that. If you just look at the slide altogether, you might think that all of these come out right from the 60s and 70s. Now I want to get into how visual art is not just poster art or just promotional thing. Sometimes it goes much beyond that, and sometimes that happens when a visual artist and a performing artist or recording artist are pretty much on the same wavelength. And that's where someone like a visual artist like Alex Gray comes in, who's a visionary artist who was actually a medically trained professional. He went to medical school and studied medical illustration and everything. And then he found psychedelics, and he got very into the spiritual side of things. And he was talking about spirituality and how human consciousness is affected by it. And the same thing was being done by another band called Tool on the side, which was also talking about the same thing through their music. Now when Alex Gray and Tool got together, a lot of magical stuff happened. Because these guys pretty much found each other, and they were like, hey man, we are pretty much on the same wavelength, so why don't we collaborate together? And it went much beyond just album covers and stage designs. These guys were part of a culture, and they were so influential from the band, from a perspective, since the 1990s almost, where they came out and they absolutely blew a lot of people out of the park. Another band that I would like to explore is the 70s heavy metal band called Iron Maiden, and Iron Maiden has been around for long enough. I think you all have heard of Iron Maiden, yes? I think the most iconic thing about Iron Maiden was the fact that they have this mascot called Eddie, who has lived on through the ages, and as you know, they're an old band, but old bands also need new fans, and how do you do that? So they collaborated with an artist called Dan Mumford, and they created this series of posters. Now Dan's style is very different from the old Iron Maiden style that you would see. He's very colorful, he's very vibrant. But they were like, hey man, you know what? You're a fan of our band, and we're a fan of your work, and so let's create a series of posters that that will totally deal with the current audience that we have, and also bring in a new level of audience. And why this is important is, while for some people you might want to print of a Rembrandt or a Mona Lisa or a Monet on your wall, some other people would want this on their wall because it truly expresses who they are as people. Another one of my favorite collaborations was with a favorite band of mine called Mastodon and another artist called Romano. And I don't even know how these guys found each other, right? Like they're both into mythical beasts and Rasputin and really bizarre things. And the kind of sound the band has is also very colorful, which Paul Romano has brought out in his artwork, where there's this very colorful palette, but it's also strangely morbid. It's still within that horror aesthetic of that metal bands tend to showcase, and I thought the final thing was magical. the reason I'm talking about this is because I want to throw some light on the fact that these wonderful forms of expression have reached Indian shores, and we have a scene here at home. Young India is now learning how to express themselves through music and through like visual art. And it goes into like things like Indian hip hop. Now, Indian hip hop has been around for a while. Yeah, it's been making waves like for a while, much before Gully Boy made it a mainstream name. Like, and Gully Boy like absolutely launched it to a mainstream status, but Young India found a voice through Indian hip hop and rap and everything, and it was a way for people to just express themselves, which is very important. Eventually, like, you know, I want to cover the rock and metal scene as well, and we have a very vibrant scene, which unfortunately, like what Gully Boy did for hip hop, Rock On was not able to do. That was just, never mind. But we do have a very, very vibrant rock and metal scene here in India, and it is so refreshing to see, like, you know, there's so many festivals nowadays where all these bands come together and play for, like, you know, sometimes there are thousands of people and sometimes it's 20 people. It doesn't matter. What matters is, like, you know, these guys have something to say and they're able to communicate, like, you know, their frustrations, and they're able to voice out the concerns of their generation to an audience, and that's how we create communities. But the visual art angle in this space sort of came about when two artists that I know of, Ruben Bhattacharya and Sameer Kulavur, had come together, and they worked with this band called Something Relevant and Joint Family, respectively, and they brought about a sort of a visual revolution. Now, both these guys have gone on in their own paths to like becoming huge design houses where they design for big bands and big music festivals that happen in the country. But they kind of were important in a way where they kicked off a revolution of visual art within the independent music scene. And nowadays we have a poster culture, merchandise culture, we have album art culture, and it's absolutely blown out of proportion, so much so that there's something called an Indian Gig Poster Archive. You can check out the website. It's got like material. It's like an entire library of like artworks for the year, from, I don't know, for the past decade. And in fact, now they're slowly moving out from the web space and starting to do events where they're curating posters and artworks for people to come and enjoy and like, you know, be part of. But it all goes back to the 1970s in Kolkata, when a band called Mohiner Ghoraguli started it all by taking, you know, Bangla folk and jazz and fusing it together and learning how to express themselves in a very unique fashion. And they were the first ones to actually explore this album art angle. And since then, like, you know, it has kicked off a movement where people are slowly learning how to express themselves. But how do we do it? How do we, like, you know, take a part of our daily lives and put our own spin on it and make sure that we connect with our audience? Everyone remembers this guy, right? Now, we can take this guy and put our own spin on it, and this is what comes out. And this is what is happening out there, like, you know, and just by pressing the play button of my cassette player, I found my own tribe, I found the meaning of life, and I found my career. And I hope that you get to go out there and find yours as well. Thank you.